Hey, y'all. This is Marina Jenkins, Executive Director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. And this is Drawing the Line, a podcast about the maps that shape our democracy and what it takes to make sure every vote counts. I am so excited today to be joined by my colleague, Olivia Mendoza. Olivia Mendoza is the Director of Litigation and Policy for the National Redistricting Foundation, which is NDRC's affiliate. The National Redistricting Foundation is a 501c3 organization that is committed to fighting gerrymandering and educating the public about what it takes to have a fair and accurate census and fair and accurate redistricting across the country. Olivia and I have worked together for many years in different roles. And so it's just really, really exciting for me to be able to introduce you all to her and for everyone to have the opportunity to hear from her about some really, really important work that the National Redistricting Foundation is doing in states across the country. Hello, Olivia.
Hi, Marina. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
I'm so excited for you to be here. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to the world of redistricting?
Oh, yes. Well, it was a very interesting journey. I was a longtime policy advocate working in the Latino community. And at some point in the process, just really came to understand how foundational redistricting is to every single policy issue that I cared about, that I was advocating for on behalf of my community. And so I'm going down the road, advocacy road, and I took a sharp turn and went to law school. So mid-career, decided to take my advocacy through a different approach, and that was through going to law school, and specifically wanted to focus on redistricting law. And here I am today.
Amazing. I have to say also just a little bit of a personal note. I remember being in law school and thinking that the people who were attending law school who had families and children at home already were like superheroes because I couldn't imagine having done that. And so Olivia is one of those amazing, spectacular humans who did what felt like impossible to do as a person who had none of those responsibilities. So kudos to Olivia.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It was a funny story. When I was a 1L, my daughter was a first grader, and she heard me talking about 1Ls one day, and she was like, "Oh, you're a first grader too, just like me." And I was like,
Yes.
"Yeah, pretty much."
So cute. So cute. And now she's
A freshman in high school.
15.
Yeah.
Just had her quince.
Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. How the time flies.
Exactly.
Speaking of, let's get into it. Today, I would love for you to talk with us about the cases that the NRF has ongoing, specifically focusing in on two cases that are going to be moving in the month of May and have some really pivotal points this month. And that's in Texas and in Georgia. So why don't we start with Texas? Can you just tell us a little bit about where we are and how we got here? Just, super high level, kind of what is happening in Texas in the world of redistricting.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe that here we are in 2025 and we're still litigating cases that came out of the 2020 redistricting cycle, but that's exactly where we are in Texas. In 2021, the National Redistricting Foundation supported voters in a lawsuit to challenge Texas congressional maps that the legislature passed. And at the height of the litigation in the fall of 2021, there were 11 parties. So it was 11 other plaintiff groups that were also challenging these maps, including the Department of Justice. So a big case, complicated, lots of parties, lots of claims, essentially saying that the maps passed by the Texas legislature either violated the Constitution, the US Constitution, or the Voting Rights Act. And so, as you can imagine, there were a lot of different twists and turns along the way. And really, because of the complicated nature of the claims, the case has moved very slowly. And so it's been 3.5 years that this case has been in pretrial, motions, discovery, appeals. and they are finally at the stage where they are ready to begin trial. And so that trial is actually going to start here in May. And a part of what made this case even more complicated, so not just because of all the plaintiff groups and
Right.
all the claims being brought, but there was another case also happening that was moving much faster called Paway, also
Hmm.
taking place in Texas, although this was in Galveston County. And
So sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah,
so Galveston, so there are cases happening, and there's all these claims that you talked about, and all different types of plaintiff groups that file different types of claims, and they got consolidated. But I hear you saying that there were some other cases or some other claims that were not consolidated with that bigger group of cases. Is that right?
that's exactly right. So the case that is going to be heard in May is really addressing the infirmities and the maps passed by the legislature in regards to the congressional map, the state legislative map. There's also some claims in regards to the state board of elections. That's like, one big monster case that's been moving super
Right.
slowly. Think of like a
Okay.
dinosaur that's like trekking along, right?
Yeah.
On the other side, or I guess I should say in another lane, there was another case called Petaway that was very specific. It was bringing some of the same challenges, but only to the maps in Galveston County commissioners. So
So
different
county
set of
commission
maps.
map.
Exactly. And so partly because of the more narrow scope of the claims, it moved much faster. But they were similar claims as the ones, that we see moving over here in what we call the LULAC case. That is the case that all the other cases were consolidated under. And
Okay.
so what Petaway did is it essentially, the plaintiff groups, again, bringing same claims under the Voting Rights Act, they initially won at the district court and at the during the appeals process. And what they won was a protection under the Voting Rights Act for the Black and Latino communities to not be cracked or packed in violation of the Voting Rights Act and diluting their votes. Unfortunately, that case then was appealed further to the entire Fifth Circuit. And part of the reason why they won, Marina, is because there's strong case precedent
Mm,
in the circuit in this district, right, saying that coalition districts, communities, Black and Latino communities can come together and bring these claims. And what
right.
we saw the Fifth Circuit do was undo that precedent.
Mm. So let's pause there for a moment because I think this is so important for folks to understand. The Voting Rights Act is legislation that was passed many years ago to protect certain communities with, who have been subject to a history of discrimination, current modern discrimination in voting. And we call those protected classes or protected groups that are protected by the Voting Rights Act. And both Black voters and Latino voters in Texas specifically are protected voters under the Voting Rights Act. And so the prevailing theory had been that these groups of voters, as long as you show what you need to show to prove that the VRA needs to be enforced, that those voters could kind of band together to show that they deserve representation that they're not getting, that their votes are being diluted, and that needs to be remedied because that dilution of the power of their vote violates the Voting Rights Act. So that's the prevailing view that had been the prevailing view in the Fifth Circuit. And then this case changed that.
That's
Am I getting that quite right?
That's absolutely right. And it changed it in what we would call, they undid their precedent. So they essentially overruled themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And this just happened last year. And what that did, Marina, is really impact the ability of to band together. So coalition claims in other cases moving forward. And so we see this Petaway case then have a direct impact on the dinosaur, the LULAC case that's moving
Mm-hmm.
forward, because of many of the multiple claims that I mentioned some of them did include coalition claims. So what we've seen in the 3.5 years is a slower process that has now been impacted by this other case. And so we are looking at smaller number of parties. Currently, as I said, when this was originally filed in 2021, there was 11 parties. There's now 7 parties that are moving forward with the litigation. And the claims have also narrowed. So there, coalition claims are now barred. So those any plaintiffs that had coalition claims have dismissed those. So what we've seen is a more streamlining of the parties and the plaintiffs and the claims as we head into this May trial.
So after 3.5 years of slow and steady, if you could call it that, or just nothing happening, is another way to say it, the court implemented or acknowledged that there was this other decision, asked the parties, what do you want to do about it? Some of these parties were dismissed by the court. Some withdrew their claims. One way or the other, sort of streamlined and simplified this case to a degree. It's still Texas, and everything, including litigation, is bigger in Texas. We all know that. But the case has been streamlined and simplified. And so now, after trudging along for 3.5 years, it feels like very suddenly the court called for this case to go for trial. But just to give an indication, Olivia, for how many issues are still in this simplified and streamlined version of the case, the trial itself is expected to last like a month, right?
That's right. So, streamlined and simplified, it's all relative, right? Absolutely relative to how complicated and big the case was when it was initially filed. And I will say that there was another big moment in the trial, or sort of the life of this case, that has really impacted the number of parties. And the other key moment besides this Paway decision was really the change in the direction and the purpose and the mission of the Department of Justice. And so the Department of Justice was actually also a party in this case. And in January of this year, the Department of Justice, of course, changed its leadership and purpose and trajectory. And so now the DOJ has also withdrawn from the case, which is one of the reasons that the case is also moving much faster.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there is something that's very typical and very normal about, the changes in administrations often mean that the types of positions that the Department of Justice has taken will shift. I think what we're seeing this year is holistically different. We just heard the news that the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice has been just absolutely hollowed out, completely gutted. I think the administration is reporting this as resignations. I think you and I know that that's not what is happening. Certainly there might be mass resignations if you're told we're not going to do any of the work that this department, that this Civil Rights Division has been doing for many years, and the important laws that it has been built to enforce and to protect the civil rights of Americans, and that we're not interested in doing that anymore, is basically what we're hearing from the administration, and what we're seeing from, a just complete emptying out of this critical division of the Department of Justice, as we've seen across the federal government, certainly. And it's just really distressing in regard to the work that we do to see the enforcement of important civil rights legislation that for many, many, many years was bipartisan. The enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was passed on a bipartisan manner historically over the past 40 years, twice, and signed by Republican presidents. These are not, these are historically things that people could agree on. And the enforcement of civil rights was something that folks could agree on. And now we're really seeing a very different animal, very different flavor of what it means to protect or not protect the rights of Americans across the country.
I think that's really, really accurate, Marina. And I don't want to underscore that. I think that the DOJ withdrawing from this case is the symptom, right? The malaise, the sickness is actually the structural changes that they're making,
Mm-hmm.
the change in mission as opposed to protecting vulnerable communities. The DOJ is weaponizing to go after these communities.
Mm-hmm.
The essential, eviscerating the departments and the staff and the personnel. And I think it is a very serious approach that has changed under this
Yeah.
administration, and unique to this administration, because I do agree with you that there are many times under changes in presidential administrations that the focus of the DOJ changes, and that makes sense, right? Because the focus of each administration is different. But never in our history have we seen what's happening to the DOJ right now in the protection of civil rights unfold the way it is right now.
Oh man. Well, thankfully, there are still many organizations, including the National Redistricting Foundation, who are going to be fighting this fight, even where we lack a Department of Justice and a Civil Rights Division who will do that on behalf of the people. And as Olivia mentioned, still 7 different groups of plaintiffs. So, a lot of energy in the nonprofit, civil rights space to fight for these rights. So, incredibly proud of the work that you all are doing, and hoping that the 4-week long trial that starts at the end of May is ultimately successful in vindicating the rights of Texans who deserve better and equal representation. All right, let's move on and talk about Georgia. There is also going to be not a district court trial, but an appellate argument this month in Georgia, in a case that the National Redistricting Foundation has been engaged in similarly for 4 years now. It feels like, right? That's how
Yeah.
time works. Tell us about what's happening in Georgia.
So similar, yes. The NRF also initiated this lawsuit against the congressional and state legislative maps back in 2021, but it's in a different posture, right? This case is now, it's gone to a full trial, and the plaintiff groups were successful on the merits. So the court found that the legislature had violated the Voting Rights Act when it passed the congressional and state legislative maps and ordered new maps to be put in place. And so this appeal that we are anticipating to begin here in May, it's one day, it's an oral argument, very different from a 4-week full trial that we're seeing in Texas. But what this appeal is essentially arguing, or the foundation of the appeal is that the plaintiffs are objecting to the maps that were passed in response to the win that they had. So they won. The court said, yes, this vote violates the Voting Rights Act. Legislature, you need to pass new maps and fix this violation. And so the legislature did. And the plaintiff groups are objecting to that remedial map, the map that was passed and that was used in this last election. And so that is what is being appealed and what will be heard in the appellate court in May.
So there's a distinction here, and I want to sort of tease this out a little bit more for our audience. There's a distinction here in the appeals of the actual win on the merits, which is to say on the question at hand, which is, did Georgia violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act by passing the map that it passed in 2021? And then there's the appeal of what is the resolution? What is the solution? What is the remedy that Georgia voters should get because of that violation? And so these are 2 different pieces of what came out of this litigation, or what is, how this litigation is continuing. And can you talk a little bit about, because I think the first part has already been heard in the 11th Circuit. So they're moving on kind of two different two different lanes.
So, yeah, let's talk about these two different appeals, right? The first appeal is in regards to whether the state of Georgia actually violated the Voting Rights Act, which the district court said, yes, you did. Georgia legislature, you need to go back and fix this. And so the state of Georgia is the one appealing that decision to the 11th Circuit. And that oral argument was heard earlier this year in January. And that is strictly on the question of whether or not the district court ruled correctly on the merits, on the question of the violation. Then the second part, when a court rules that there was a violation, or there is a remedy that needs to be implemented to fix whatever the court found was found to be improper or unconstitutional, that's a second phase, right? And so the legislature took back what the court said, drew a new map, passed it. The plaintiffs that had won that order to get the new map passed then said, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't actually fix what we think is wrong. So we are going, and the district court heard that in a hearing and said, no, we think that this is fine. The remedial map fixes what we think is wrong with the violation of the Voting Rights Act. And so the plaintiff groups then are appealing that decision, of the district court's decision, to the 11th Circuit to say, the merits, the district court got it right, but on fixing the map and creating a new remedy, we think the court got it wrong. So two different appeals asking two different questions.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think not very typical. This isn't something that we see a lot in the course of litigation, where you have pieces of the outcome of a case, the sort of final resolution of a case, being appealed in different ways. And so they're also kind of on this interesting timeline where, as you said, the merits appeal happened back in January. And so, it's been a few months. It would be, reasonable to expect to hear back from the 11th Circuit panel that heard that argument. But we're probably expecting them to hold it back and see what happens with the argument on the remedy, but we don't know for sure if that's what will happen. And so, because I think, Olivia, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're two different groups of judges, right? So for those in our audience unfamiliar with how the federal circuit courts work, typically you'll have a panel of 3 judges, and the different circuits operate in different ways. But in the 11th Circuit, this is the way it works. And you'll get a group of 3 judges to hear your appeal. And so, and that's, assigned as the case comes. And then oftentimes you'll be able to say, well, my case is, connected to this other case, and so you should hear them together. But these two are not connected on the appellate level. So there's a second group of judges that's going to be considering the other question. So it's just an interesting, I'm just like in my nerdy, civil procedure lawyer nerding out on just an interesting situation that we find ourselves in from a civil procedure perspective.
It is very interesting, and I won't even add more complication other than to say that, and there's also different plaintiff groups, right? There's the NRF, supported voters, there's other voter groups. And it reminds me of a few years ago, my civil procedure professor asked me to come back to the class and just talk to the class about civil procedure. And the one thing I said to them was, take this seriously. So much of actual lawyering happens, before the trial and then post-trial, right, through the process, the appeals. And so really understanding civil procedure and the interesting paths in federal court are key. And I think that this case highlights it.
Yeah, so true. I know. I think someone should have given me that advice when I was going through school, but it's good advice to give. It's so true. All right. So that is happening. When is the appeal again?
May 15th is the oral argument.
Is the oral argument. Thank you. Okay, great. So exciting month for NRF litigation. Again, as Olivia noted, You might think that redistricting happens every 10 years and then it's all resolved. Nope. This is a perpetual fight. And the National Redistricting Foundation continues. How many active cases are there right now?
Well, we're also still litigating in Alabama, Florida, and Louisiana, and potentially another case depending on how things develop with the census. So, a lot of things in the hopper.
Yeah. Well, we will have you back to talk about all of those because I know there's so much more that we could talk about. But Olivia, thank you so, so much for joining me for this conversation today. And I really appreciate it. I know our audience appreciates hearing from the experts and from the folks doing the work. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Marina.
If you like our show, please follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Dem Redistrict or visit our website at democraticredistricting.com. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.
This show is produced by Reed Dudley, Sophia Pedroso, and Manuel Marce. Special thanks to Alex Yang. Editing and mixing by Play Pretend Media. This podcast is paid for by the National Democratic Redistricting Committee.